Thank you for the committee for inviting me and for all of you here today and to follow along on this. I think this conference is an example of what one theologian once said, that catechists should follow dogmaticians. But I think based on my lunch conversation today, where they were talking about furries, and I don't know what furries are, but I think it's dogmaticians chasing catechists. No? No. Okay, that wasn't worth the joke. So mine is a little bit off the topic, but very close, because in the Missouri Synod, we've always understood that our parish schools are doing catechesis. So I'm just going to really give an overview of the history of that and start with the history in Lutheranism in general, not just Missouri Synod. And I was worried I would copy some of what Pastor Kieser is doing, but he has only one sentence or two that repeats what I have. So you won't get repetition there. So the first section is Introduction and Overview. Why do Lutherans have elementary and high schools? Why don't they just let their children go to public schools like almost everybody else? And did you ever ask yourself that question? And do you know the answers to the question? Well, it's a long and complicated story, but the basic reason Lutherans have parish schools, that is, schools built and supported by the parish or congregation, is that Martin Luther told us to do that. It's how it worked in Germany, Scandinavia, and the Baltic nations, where Lutherans were dominant. This is also how it worked in the North American colonies in the United States, where there were Lutherans, until the state of Pennsylvania adopted its public school system in 1834. After 1834, the older synods of American Lutherans lost their parish schools because the public schools were cheap or free, and the public schools posed no obvious threat to Christian beliefs or morality at that time. The newer synods of American Lutherans, that is, those started in the 19th century, did not want to lose the language of their homeland. So as the Missouri Synod people immigrated here in the mid to later 19th century, congregations and schools were planted all over the Midwest, speaking German in church and school. Wherever those people moved to in the United States, including where I presently serve in California, they started German-speaking congregations and schools like those in the Midwest. And this all changed with World War I, when Germany became an enemy in the United States. Slowly but surely, church services and school classes in the Missouri Synod changed from the German to English language. Now, in each congregation, it happened overnight, but across the Synod, it took a long time, starting about 1914. But this time, the Lutheran churches, instead of losing their parish schools, found them blossoming in the 1920s. So why was that? Well, they grew partly because the congregations believed in their school's mission, and partly because at that time public schools were being influenced by modernism, which included pragmatism, for example, John Dewey, the new morality, and the philosophy of evolution, for example, Charles Darwin. Christians in the 20th century, that is, all Christians who rejected modernism and wanted to teach their children traditional morality and Christian beliefs, found that the Missouri Synod schools were an ideal, safe place for their children. Many people of non-German ancestry and non-Scandinavian ancestry joined the Missouri Synod congregations because of their schools. The Missouri Synod schools have proven over the years to be its most effective evangelism program for long-term membership, growth, and retention. Congregations, districts, and Synod have poured an enormous amount of time, energy, and money into creating and sustaining our Lutheran schools. But we're now well into the 21st century. will our commitments and success in parish school education hold? Will our Missouri Synod parish schools continue to affirm their founding principles and our wonderful heritage of Lutheran education? Will our pastors and laymen continue to labor and make the necessary sacrifices for the future of our children and young people? Or will it be whittled away through inattention, inaction, and or the influence of non-Lutheran ideas, attitudes, and ecclesiastical practices? So we start with Luther on education in his essays 1520, 1524, and 1530. What did Martin Luther tell the pastors and laymen of Protestant Europe to do in the realm of education? Luther began his reform of education by giving directions to the emperor and princes of Central Europe for the improvement of the universities first, in his treatise to the Christian nobility of the German nation concerning the reform of the Christian estate, published in 1520. The only thing he mentioned about elementary schools in that treatise was that girls should also receive education. And that was a revolutionary idea for its day. Obviously, he was a heretic. He was under trial right at that time. That just gave a lot more people, so he's got to be a heretic. He wants girls to get an education? It was revolutionary. 4 years later, Luther came back to the topic of education, and this time wrote a systematic treatise on the topic of both lower and higher education in 1524, titled, "To the councilmen of all cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools." While the Renaissance humanists before Luther had ideas for improving universities and private tutoring, the Protestant Reformation led by Luther set at its goal universal, even compulsory education for everyone. Where the churches could not or would not supply education for children, Luther demanded that mayors and city councils supply the need. Here are then just a few relevant quotes from the 1524 treatise that still ring true today. I quote, "It's not surprising that the wicked devil takes a position on this matter of education and induces carnal and worldly hearts thus to neglect the children and young people. Who can blame Satan for it? He is the ruler and God of this world," John 14:30. How can we expect him to permit and promote the proper training of the young? He would indeed be a fool to allow and promote the establishment in his kingdom of this world of the very thing by which that kingdom must be most speedily overthrown, and which would happen if he were to lose that choice morsel, our dear young people. No one is aware of the devil's wily purpose. No one is on the alert, but just goes quietly along. Even though only a single boy could thereby be trained to become a real Christian, we ought properly to give 100 gulden, that's about $1,500, to this cause, for every gulden, about $15, that we would give to fight the enemies of the German Empire. For one real Christian is better and can do more good than all the men on earth. Think about that one. One person, a real Christian. And Pastor Kieser quotes that too. It's a great quote. Here's another quote from Luther in the same essay about community priorities. "My dear sirs, if we have to spend such large sums every year on guns, roads, bridges, dams, and countless similar items to ensure the temporal peace and prosperity of a city, why should not much more be devoted to the poor, neglected youth, at least enough to engage 1 or 2 competent men to teach school?" And then Luther points out the spiritual nature of the school, what's actually going on there. I quote, "Let this then, my dear sirs and friends, be the first consideration to influence you, namely that herein, by educating our youth, we are fighting against the devil, as the most dangerous and subtle enemy of all. End of quote. And then Luther gives a third consideration, which is the command of God. I quote, "The third consideration is by far the most important of all, namely the command of God, who through Moses urges and enjoins parents so often to instruct their children. Indeed, for what purpose do we older folk exist, other than to care for, instruct, and bring up the young? It is utterly impossible for these ignorant young people to instruct and protect themselves. This is why God has entrusted them to us, who are older and who know from experience what is best for them. It is a sin and a shame that matters have come to such a pass that we have to urge and be urged to educate our children and young people and to seek their best interests, when nature itself should drive us to do this, and even the heathen afford us abundant examples of it." End of quote. 6 years later, Martin Luther returned to the topic of education in his famous Sermon on Keeping Children in School from 1530. Now, I've only pulled a few quotes from this brilliant sermon here. I quote, "Now, if it is true and certain that God himself has established and instituted the spiritual estate, that is the office of preaching and the word, with his own blood and death, we may conclude that he will have it highly honored. He will not allow it to be destroyed or to die out, but will have it maintained until the last day. For the gospel and the church must abide until the last day, as Christ says in the last chapter of Matthew, 'Lo, I am with you always to the close of the age.' But by whom then shall it be maintained? Oxen and horses, dogs and swine will not do it, neither will wood or stone. We men shall have to do it, for this office is not committed to oxen and horses, but to us men. But where shall we get men for it except for those who have children? If you will not raise your children for this office, and the next man will not, and so on, and no fathers or mothers will give their children to our God for this work, what will become of the spiritual office and estate? The old men now in the office of preaching the word will not live forever. They're dying off every day, and there are no others to take their place." I always reminded of that every time I look at the Lutheran Witness obituaries. Classmates, every month. Bye, guys. Luther continues about 9 pages later. "In saying this, I do not mean to insist that every man must train his child for this office of preaching the word, for it is not necessary that all boys become pastors, preachers, and schoolmasters. It is well to know that the children of lords and other important people are not to be used for this work, for the world also needs heirs of ruling offices and estates, people without whom the temporal authority would go to pieces. I'm speaking of the common people, who used to have their children educated for the sake of the livings and the benefices, but now keep them away from learning to earn a livelihood." Luther then elaborates, which I don't quote, on the need for education of children and youth, for civil government, for lawyers, for jurists, for city officials, soldiers, and for writers. And then he writes this, I quote, "At this point, I should also mention how many educated men are needed in the fields of medicine and the other liberal arts. Of these two needs, one could write a huge book and preach for half a year. Where are the preachers, jurists, and physicians to come from if grammar and other rhetorical arts are not taught? For such teaching is the spring from which they all must flow. To speak of this here in detail would be too big a task. I will simply say briefly that a diligent and upright schoolmaster or teacher, or anyone who faithfully trains and teaches boys and girls, can never be adequately rewarded or repaid with any amount of money, as even the heathen Aristotle says. Nevertheless, this work is as shamefully despised among us as if it amounted to nothing at all. And still we call ourselves Christians. If I could, leave the preaching office and my other duties, or had to do so, there is no other office I would rather have than that of schoolmaster or teacher of boys and girls. For I know that next to that of preaching, this is the best, greatest, and most useful office there is. End of quotes from Luther. Another great quote to put on your wall. So, parish schools in early American Lutheranism. Maybe you didn't even know we had them here. In colonial America, the pattern of schooling was different for each region. In the South and Virginia, schools were almost unknown in the 17th century. The common people were generally illiterate. The exceptions were the landed gentry who hired tutors or sent them to England to study. In New England, there were many schools, since the Puritan fathers wanted a public that could read the Bible and discuss theology. Now, the people were taxed or levied to support the schools by the government. The supervision of the New England schools was given to the churches. In the middle colonies, where most Lutherans ended up, there was a similar motive for having schools as in New England, but it was divided by confession. The Dutch Reformed, who controlled New York for a while, established schools attached to the parish church. They were, of course, expected to teach religion based on the Reformed confessions. Somewhat later, the Dutch Reform made the schools the responsibilities of parental societies. The Lutherans in the middle colonies, for their part, did the same as the Dutch Reformed. Pennsylvania was the most favorable colony for Lutheran churches and schools, and the schools thrived there for quite some time. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, that was the name of that synod, had the following statistics: 1804, 89 parish schools; 1813, 164 parish schools; 1820, 206 parish schools. Then, in 1834, the state of Pennsylvania adopted the Common School Law, in which the English language was used exclusively, religion was not taught, and a general tax of the public supported all expenses. The Lutherans could have continued to support their schools, but the idea of free education of children and youth proved too alluring to the layman for financial reasons. It was probably agreeable to the pastors too, since they often had to do the teaching in the parish schools, although the preferred pattern was to hire a parish school teacher for that job. Well, this was the death knell of the parish school among the early American Lutherans, at least among those whose congregations were in states on the Atlantic seaboard, and they all pretty much followed the Pennsylvania pattern. The beginnings now of parish schools in the Missouri Synod. The Missouri Synod was started in the 1840s by pastors and laymen who could not take Lutheran theology and practice for granted. Those who had some early experience with the East Coast Lutherans, for example, Friedrich Wyneken, found that those Lutherans had already succumbed to the syncretizing religious spirit of the United States and its civil religion. Those who left Germany for religious reasons, for example, C.F.W. Walther, were concerned about the unionistic religious spirit that had already conquered the Kingdom of Prussia and was gaining strength everywhere else in Protestant Europe, especially in the Germanies. They remembered the admonitions of Luther, which I've just read, some of those, to support schools. They also remembered that the preface of the Book of Concord constantly refers to the Lutheran doctrine being taught in churches and schools. And I've got quotes in the footnotes where you can look that up. So to those Missouri Synod forefathers, it did not seem possible to be a truly Lutheran church without having parish schools. When the Saxon colonists came over in 1839 and settled in St. Louis and Perry County, Missouri, they brought with them 5 teachers: Johann Helwig, Johann Cook, Johann Winter, A.G. Schneider, and teacher Mueller. Of those teachers, only one, Johann Winter, was employed by the Perry County or St. Louis churches, first at Wittenberg on the Mississippi River and then at Altenburg in Missouri. By 1844, Winter was in charge of a school of 53 pupils in Altenburg. The famous log cabin called Concordia College in Perry County was first established in the village of Dresden, where CFW Walther's church was located. I think he's really the one that started that. Its teachers were initially Walther and 3 candidates for the pastoral ministry, and they were waiting parish calls: Johann Binger, Ottomar Feuerbringer, and Theodor Brome. Now, the use of pastoral candidates for teaching was common in Germany, where they were known as Privatdozenten. And I think that was mostly individual tutoring, but they could be used in larger classes. When these pastoral candidates received calls and Walther moved to St. Louis, the school was moved to Altenburg. In June 1843, pastoral candidate Johann Gainer was called to serve that school. In St. Louis, the congregation that became known as Trinity St. Louis, which is in the present Soulard district, gave the initial task of teaching at school to the pastoral candidate Karl Geyer, who served from 1839 to 1840 until he received his parish call. The congregation then called pastoral candidate Johann Binger from Perry County, who served till 1844. At his departure, the congregation called Edward Roschke, a master tailor with complete gymnasium training. CFW Walther later explained the thinking of the Saxon colonists in his biography of Johann Binger. He wrote, I quote, "In the Saxon Lutheran congregation, it was the rule always to establish at once the office of teaching, Schulamt, together with the office of preaching, Predigtamt. Within a few days after the arrival of the first division of the Company of Immigrants in St. Louis, a school was founded there. If no teacher could be appointed, it was a self-evident thing that the minister took over, together with his ministerial office, the office of schoolmaster, and ministered both according to his ability." End of quote from Walther. I should also mention here the venture of the Saginaw Bay colonies in Michigan to their mission school among the Chippewa Indians, teaching Chippewa Indian children. August Kramer started the work in 1846 of June with the cooperation of Pastor Wilhelm Lea in Bavaria. The Franconian colonists also made provision for a parish school for their children, as is reflected in their church order of 1844 to 1845. At the organization of the Missouri Synod in 1847, there were only 12 congregations, with pastors and lay delegates, plus some advisory delegates. There was no report on the schools that year. At the 1848 convention, back then they had a convention every year, there was an incomplete school report for the 1847 calendar year, which gave a total enrollment of 508 parish school students. They were located at St. Louis, Altenburg, and St. Charles, Missouri, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Allen, Adams, and Marshall counties of Indiana, Van Wert and Marysville, Ohio, Minden or New Minden, Illinois, and Frankenmuth and Monroe, Michigan. The growth of Missouri Synod's parish school system in its first 25 years can be seen in these selected statistics. 1847, with 15 congregations, 15 schools, 764 students. In 1856, almost 10 years later, 125 congregations, 119 schools, 4,646 students. In 1865, 253 congregations, 243 schools, 16,891 students. And then in 1871, 419 congregations, 408 schools, and 26,455 students. Now notice that in 1871, the last statistic, there were only 11 congregations out of 419 that did not have parish schools. That's only 3% of the Missouri Synod congregations without schools. So clearly, the parish school in the 19th century was a standard feature of Missouri Synod congregations, not an optional one. This was even in the Synod's constitution at the time, which demanded as a condition of membership that a congregation give, quote, provision of a Christian education, Schulunterricht, for the children of the congregation. That's chapter 2, section 6 of the, I think that's the 1854 Constitution. So what did these schools look like? Again, think of it. Every church has a school. So now we look at the curriculum. The Missouri Synod elementary schools have been like other elementary schools with some unique emphases. One way to gauge this is to see what the curriculum was at the first Missouri Synod's Teachers Seminary in 1869. That was at Addison, Illinois, which later moved to River Forest and now is known as Concordia University, Chicago. 3 professors were employed by the Synod at Addison to teach young men the subject matter and skills, so you're teaching teacher candidates, the skills that they would then use to teach their elementary school age students. And this was a 5-year course of study. The following list is class assignments for those 3 professors. The numbers refer to periods taught in that subject per week, so you're looking at it from the standpoint of the professor. But all these courses had to be taken by the students. There were no, what do they call them, options? What do they call those things? There were no electives. This was the course of study. C.A.T. Sella, professor, taught Bible history, Lutheran confessions, geography, English, by the way, that was a foreign language to them, well, at least to most of them, and piano. Look at that, 27 periods. Then Karl Brauer, singing, violin, piano, organ, and music theory. Well, he's your music guy. Then J.C.W. Lindemann, who also shows up in Pastor Kieser's paper. He'll tell you more about him. Catechism, Introduction to the Bible, Memorization, Introduction to Education, Practical Catechetics, German, Mathematics, History, Natural History, which he means science, Penmanship, both in German and English, and Drawing, which was an art class. So all these courses were taught in the 5-year program and required of all students that were preparing to teach parish schools. And there were no students there that were not preparing to be teachers. And here you can see the universal 3 R's of elementary schools: reading in German and English, writing in German and English, and arithmetic or mathematics. Now, there's already a difference from public schools in that Missouri Synod parish school students became bilingual at an early age. If their parents only allowed them to speak German at the home, which my grandmother, Missouri Synod grandmother, grew up that way, then they learned English at the school. If they came from an English-speaking family, then they learned German at the school. So everybody was bilingual, at least in this period of time. Geography, history, science, and art are still common subjects in elementary schools today. And we would expect the history and science courses to have Christian emphases and perspectives as is proper. And what's unique about this curriculum is, of course, its religious subject matter, and there's a lot of it. And surprisingly, its depth and excellence in music. All elementary school students and their teachers in the Missouri Synod were expected to learn how to sing. All elementary school teachers were expected to learn how to play piano, violin, and organ. There's somebody back there that's learning how to play violin. Good for you. With piano getting 6 times the number of course hours as violin and organ. So in other words, every teacher graduating from Addison could play piano with skill and use it to lead singing of hymns and songs in the classroom. There was a piano in every classroom in the parish schools. With this foundation, the Missouri Synod trained future congregation members to participate in worship with a great literature of Christian hymnody and Lutheran liturgy. The Lutheran Church in America, and especially the Missouri Synod and its allies like the Wisconsin Synod, thus truly became a singing church far beyond its peers. The Parish School and the Lutheran Synodical Conference. The idea of the Lutheran Parish School was not unique to the Missouri Synod. As we've previously seen, the idea and practice came from Luther and was found in the United States prior to the arrival of the Missouri Synod. After the Civil War, there were several Lutheran synods in the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains that spoke German, Norwegian, and/or English, and they were all in church fellowship. The expression of that fellowship on an organizational level was called the Evangelical Lutheran Synodical Conference of North America. You can see that title on the title page of the Lutheran hymnal. It's that organization that put that hymnal together. It included at various times Missouri Synod, the Concordia Synod of Pennsylvania and other states, the English Synod, the Michigan Synod, the Nebraska Synod, the Nebraska Synod's in there. What happened to them? Oh, whatever. The Ohio Synod, the Slovak Synod, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Illinois, the Minnesota Synod, the Norwegian Synod, we know what happened to them, and the Wisconsin Synod. In later years, the Norwegian Synod split, and the smaller of the two parts, called the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, or the ELS, also joined the Synodical Conference when the larger portion left. Now, this is significant for the Lutheran schools because in 1877, this conference of leaders from all these different synods discussed the following thesis, Thesis 12. It is exceedingly inconsistent with the Church's confessional position if an ecclesiastical body which calls itself Lutheran and wants to be Lutheran does not, to the extent that it is able, show earnestness and zeal to establish orthodox parochial schools where they do not exist. Sounds like a heavy dose of the law there. Yeah, we need reminders, we need admonitions. And then Thesis 13. It is a further inconsistency with the Church's confessional position if a Lutheran fellowship does not insist that in its congregations only Orthodox liturgical books, hymnooks, catechisms, instruction, and devotional books be used, or if it does not do its utmost to see that unorthodox books of this type be done away with, where they are in use, and orthodox books be introduced. I think we could use that admonition too. Not all of you, but you know what I'm talking about. The discussion that ensued at the conference in 1877 spent most of its time on Thesis 12. The report about Thesis 13 indicates that the term instructional books was intended to refer to books used by the parish schools, described in Thesis 12. The report after this and the proceedings of that conference include this statement, which was a result of the discussion of the two theses, and I quote, "An additional major reason which should spur us on to establish parochial schools is also the mission work, which we are thereby able to carry on among the children of those people who do not belong to our church. Experience teaches that many such children can be won, and that after confirmation, they still remain faithful. For that reason, a congregation must be willing to pay the price to erect schools and to not require a higher school tax or tuition from those who are not members of the congregation. In this way, we can conduct a great mission activity and through the children win the parents themselves." End of quote. The Concordia Synod, Illinois Synod, English Synod, and Slovak Synod eventually merged into the Missouri Synod. The Michigan Synod, Minnesota Synod, and Nebraska Synod eventually merged into the Wisconsin Synod. All these synods were the most zealous in establishing parish schools, with the result that their laymen became very knowledgeable in Lutheran doctrine and Bible. As a later result, both the Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod resisted the trend toward Bible skepticism and doctrinal ignorance that characterized the other Lutheran synods that merged into the American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church in America, finally forming the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA, in 1988. Now, I'm a historian, and Historically, it is difficult to determine chief causes, but there's no doubt about the correlation of the commitment of those synods that established parish schools and their later faithfulness to the scriptures and the Lutheran confessions, generations later. This was indeed the intent of our forefathers, as can be seen in the essays given in the Missouri Synod's Western District in 1870 and 1871, and the Missouri Synod's Synodical Convention in 1872 at the Synod's Silver Jubilee. You can look that up in the footnotes. We can thank God that today His word is still proclaimed in its truth and purity, and Luther's doctrine is preserved in the Missouri Synod, Wisconsin Synod, and Evangelical Lutheran Synod, much of that due to the Lutheran parish schools. Now, how much time do I have? What time? What? I got 20 minutes. Okay. I'll have to cut some of this out, but that's okay. You have it in hand. So let's look at a cameo portrait. What were Missouri Synod parish schools like at the beginning of the 20th century? Now, I don't think there's anybody here that was around then. Maybe some of you. You know who I'm looking at, that you're not quite that old. Okay, so this would be the generation of our grandparents or great-grandparents. This would be after the parish schools had the opportunity to grow, to work out their problems, because anytime you start something new, there's going to be problems, and achieve their full development, but before they faced the transition to the English language, because that introduced huge problems, changed everything. Well, to determine this, I offer here a cameo portrait of one school, Holy Cross Lutheran School in the South City area of St. Louis. This was the school that was next to Holy Cross Lutheran Church and on the same block as the old Concordia Seminary on Jefferson Avenue. If you know where CPH is today in St. Louis, it's in the same area. It thus had the distinction of educating the children of the faculty of Concordia Seminary from 1860 to 1926. That one school did most of those students. And you can be sure that that Orthodox faculty, which included Francis Pieper, made sure that things at that school, in particular, were Orthodox and proper, since their own children were being educated and formed there. That's why this is an interesting study. Holy Cross Lutheran School published an extensive history book in commemoration of their 125th anniversary in 1976. The material that I quote or present here is from that book. The school was founded in 1850, so that's 12 years or so after the Saxons had been here, with teacher Henry Irk. He kind of irked some of the parents, I think. He had been trained for a teaching profession in Germany, so this was native to his profession, but he didn't come over with the Saxon immigration. They just found him there in Perry County. He was recruited for this job by a CFW Walther. He ended up teaching there for 41 years and died in a streetcar accident in 1891. The interesting thing about Holy Cross is that its school preceded the organization of the church by 8 years. So teacher Irk was teaching in a house in that area, in those blocks, 8 years before they started the school. And why did they do that? It was because there were a lot of German Lutherans that were Missouri Synod that had moved from Soulard or wherever they were into that new area. And this was not an unusual situation for city churches when their members, the members of our churches, moved into new city districts or suburbs. They often started the school first. Just made sense. The first female teacher was contracted at Holy Cross Lutheran School in 1860. That's 10 years after the school started, a Miss von Lahr. Other women who taught in the first decades were Mrs. Kleist, Mrs. Rickmeyer, Miss Vegi, and Miss Berta Irk. It was not until 1868 that teacher Henry Irk had another male teacher colleague to work with. Mr. Reinhold Kerner, who served for 26 years. Well, this should put to rest the common idea that only men were teachers in the Missouri Synod's early years. The first principal of the school was Henry F. Holter, who served as teacher from 1884 to 1915 and as principal from 1892 to 1907. It was in the latter days of Holter's service that a fire destroyed the entire school along with all of its contents and records. It was 1913. The church immediately rebuilt the school and reopened in 1914. Rooms were rented in the neighborhood to continue classes in the interim. So how do we know what's going on in that school? It's because they sent out a prospectus to the neighborhood, to the churches and everywhere saying, we're not dead, we didn't burn down, we're still operational, and this is what we have to offer. And that's why we know what was actually going on there. This is the prospectus, and I quote from it. Holy Cross Lutheran School is one of the oldest institutions in South St. Louis, for it will enter upon its 65th year in September 1914. That should ring a bell. I'm hearing the guns of August there. During all these years, the school has remained loyal to its ideals, it being a Christian institution. Its aims are to educate the pupils not only to be good American citizens, but to be Christians and to lead Christian lives. The Word of God forms the foundation in this institution for the education of the children. Holy Cross Lutheran School has 8 grades. All the grammar school branches are taught by a corps of able male teachers. The religious instruction is given in the German and the English language. That's the religious instruction, both German and English. The pupils are taught to speak, read, and write the German language. U.S. history, geography, arithmetic are of course taught in the English language. The graduates of Holy Cross Lutheran School are admitted to local high schools upon the recommendation of the principal of the school. The tuition charges are 75 cents per month per child. Gosh, I can't believe it. If there are 3 or more children from one family, you get a tuition break. So that's $2 per month. And this is the big thing, the big innovation, because they were the first ones to do this in the Missouri Synod. A kindergarten has been added to the school. The instruction in the kindergarten is for free. On account of the beautiful location of the school, many parents ought to take advantage of this feature, et cetera, et cetera. And then it talks about the advantage of the facilities. That's the end of my quote. So now this notice seems to contradict my previous observation that there were female teachers at Holy Cross. To see the actual situation, we can look at the group faculty portraits in the school history book, which gives the faculty composition in terms of male and female. And I give this. 1908, there were 7 male, no female. 1911, 7 male, no female. 1915, 6 male, 1 female. 1925, 5 male, 3 female. 1932, 8 male, 3 female. 1950, 5 male, 5 female. 1956, 6 male, 4 female. Now, this does not, of course, tell us anything about which grades or courses the females taught or their own education. But it does tell us, for most of its history, Holy Cross Lutheran School had a co-educational faculty. Missouri Synod parish schools after the transition to the English language. How is the Lutheran parish school understood in the Missouri Synod after the Synod had transitioned to the English language and before it began to be influenced in certain places by modernism and theology and educational theory? And this modernism, that influenced Pastor Kieser will explain that in his paper. For a window into this period, we can look at Edward W.A. Kaler's A Christian Pedagogy, published in 1930. At the time, Kaler was teaching a required course titled Christian Pedagogy at Concordia Teachers College in River Forest, Illinois. So this book then tells us what the college students who were planning to be Lutheran teachers were being taught at the time. Kaler admits in the foreword in his book that the general groundwork of the present volume and much of the subject matter was taken from J.C.W. Lindemann's excellent chapters on Schulerziehung, that's school training. And again, the Lindemann is in Kieser's paper. Lindemann had been the president and professor at Addison Teachers Seminary from 1864 to 79. So that means that the ideas and practices in 1930 in Kaler's book go back to the beginning of the LCMS elementary education program and demonstrates great continuity across the 19th and 20th centuries. At various times in the LCMS elementary education program, its leaders looked to the public schools for ideas into their methods and practices. Regarding the public schools, Kaler said this, I quote from his book, "We ought to be very careful in our criticism of the public schools. We must not imagine that because they lack Christian instruction and training, they're also of no count in other respects. Let us study their courses and their methods, their requirements and their achievements, and make use of whatever is sane, good, and profitable." Kaler also said in that book, quote, "We must not create the impression as though we expect the state schools to make suitable provision for the Christian instruction and training of children. We oppose every attempt on the part of the state to do that. It is in the interest of the state to provide facilities for the education of its citizens. But it is no fault or neglect of the civil authorities if they do not provide a religious education. On the contrary, they would transgress the limit of their power and trespass upon the most personal rights of individuals if they would teach and enforce upon all under their jurisdiction a certain type of religious education." End of quote. Although Kaler was a strong promoter of the Lutheran parish school and considered it next to the Christian home, quote, "the most effective agency for the Christian training of children," he also commented on the Sunday school as an agency for Christian education for children when no parish school was available. Comparing the Sunday school to the Lutheran parish school, Kaler said this in his Christian pedagogy, quote, "It stands to reason that a child occupying himself intensely with the study of God's word and being subject to Christian influence 5 days a week will receive more lasting impressions and a more thorough Christian training than a child that attends Sunday school but once a week for a brief hour. While half a loaf is better than none, and a good Christian Sunday school is better than no Christian school at all, a true evaluation of the Christian parish school will show that both in instruction and training, it is far superior to the best Sunday school." End of quote. Continue. Since the teaching of religion is an essential part of the curriculum of a parish school, Lutheran teachers ought to be knowledgeable in Holy Scripture and have a good understanding of biblical doctrine. With respect to knowing Scripture, Kaler observed, I quote, "As the Word of God is the chief means of Christian training, it is evident that a Christian pedagogue must acquire an exact knowledge of its teachings and of their use. In order to teach plainly and to train effectively, the educator must himself have a thorough knowledge of the Christian doctrine. Vague and hazy knowledge is often the cause of indefinite and ineffective training." End of quote. To assist students in learning Scripture and doctrine in an exact and thorough way, Kaler authored a book in 1939 titled A Summary of Christian Doctrine, which was still being used at Concordia Teachers College, River Forest in the late 1970s to teach education majors at that college. It's presently available through CPH in its 3rd revised edition. So if you want to know what our Missouri Synod Lutheran schools are expected to teach today in Christian doctrine, you can read Kaler's A Summary of Christian Doctrine, the Book of Concord, Martin Luther's Small Catechism of 1529, and the latest catechism of the Missouri Synod titled Luther's Small Catechism with Explanation, which you're probably all somewhat familiar with. I think I'm almost out of time. I have about 4 minutes. Is that right? 4 minutes. So I will skip to my last section called the Lutheran Difference. And what I'm skipping over is another cameo portrait from 1950. Now we come to the question of What's been different about Lutheran schools compared to the alternatives? Our schools have been different from public schools in that they are intentionally religious schools with moral instruction. The separation of church and state that restricts public school teachers in matters of faith and morals has not restricted our teachers from sharing their Christian faith, teaching the Bible, praying with students, and teaching the students what the Bible says about what is right and wrong. How have Missouri Synod parish schools been different from other religious schools? For example, the Roman Catholic parish schools, which is the largest parish school system in the United States, and the more recent evangelical inter-parish schools. Almost all Christian parish schools have teachers who share their Christian faith, teach the Bible, pray with their students, and teach the students what the Bible says about what is right and wrong. We are glad that these other schools do this, because this builds a strong fabric of Christianity into our communities and our nation. But there have been some differences in Lutheran schools simply because we are Lutherans. That means the gospel has predominated in our teaching, not the law, because the gospel is the power of salvation for those who have faith. Romans 1:16. So we talk a lot about the gospel, even with kindergarten kids. That means that we've talked mostly about Jesus. Who's in the front of the church here, pointing the way? He is the way, the truth, and the life. John 14:6. Jesus says no one can come to the Father through prayer or other means except through Jesus. John 14:6. It means that we've talked mostly about God's love for all people, because this is what caused God to send Jesus into the world. John 3:16. And to prepare the Israelites to hear and accept Jesus, their Messiah. Now, if there's a single idea that we Lutherans wanted our students to learn, it's the fourth article of the Augsburg Confession, which states, quote, "People cannot be justified before God by their own strength, merits, or works, but are freely justified for Christ's sake through faith when they believe they are received into favor and their sins are forgiven on account of Christ, who by his death made satisfaction for our sins. This faith God imputes for righteousness in his sight," Romans 3:4. But why is this idea of justification so important? Because it defines and explains what saving faith is. The person who believes these things that we've just put there in that paragraph, 4 or 5 sentences, person who believes these things and has this faith is saved eternally. Our religious curriculum has thus been focused on this idea, although its full extent is defined by Luther's small catechism. Our Lutheran schools are indeed a treasure to benefit parents, children, as well as our neighbors in the community. May our Lord continue to bless our schools as they continue to teach God's words for generations to come. Thank you for your attention.
Craig Meissner from Holy Cross, Kansas City. I started seeing some red flags when you got to page 8 with Kaler's assertions about the public school and adopting the methods and whatnot, and material available from there. Actually, I was sort of seeing it with the transition from German to English, but you know how that goes. But when these new methods of the public schools, and of course what's going on in that time is Dewey's philosophy is being implemented. This is all under the assumption of rationalism, Enlightenment rationalism, Kantianism, etc. Is this a time when our schools often, we do teach the same content, but it's not only content as such that you could just spill out on a page. There's also elements of music that I think that we got away from, and other ways that all of this was arranged in the entire context that can diminish catechesis, imparting the faith more thoroughly. You know, it's not just the the medium, but the message and the medium are both important. And is that the time where we're getting away from those older media?
So good, thank you, Craig. Excellent question, and I asked myself the same question when I put those quotes in there, and I'm thinking, well, did Edward Kaler know what was going on at the University of Chicago at that time, or at Harvard, or at Yale? It could be because who made this comment? I think it was actually Herman Sasse made a comment about our faculties after we had the transition of faculty. You know, we lost a lot of our faculty at St. Louis in the 40s. And in the 50s, we had a whole brand new group of people, and it was about the time that Herman Sasse came over after the war. And he said something to the effect that they quote these German authors, but they have no idea what they're actually saying. So I think probably that there was a degree of insularity. That means you're insulated from the ideas, maybe not intentional, but I don't think they really knew what was going on. And I think when we hear Kieser's paper, he'll kind of explain how that came in. Because I know when I was at Concordia River Forest, and I remember some of the professors were in favor of the pragmatic ideology for education that Dewey brought in, and others were against. So the question among the students was always, do we or don't we? You'll remember that, right? So it was kind of controversial even when we were there. So I think that's a historical study that maybe if somebody has not done it it had to be done at the doctoral level, is to say, how and when did these ideas start percolating into our, because we only had up until, what was it, when did Concordia St. Paul go 4 years? Did anybody know? Nobody knows. I think it was in early 60s or late 50s. So up until the late 50s, we only had Seward and River Forest as teacher seminaries or teacher colleges. So all you would have to do is to look at their published journals or the LEA and see, are they talking about what's going on in American education or English or German education? I don't know. I don't exactly know, but it's apparent to me that I think that Kaler is somewhat ignorant of what's going on, but maybe it's just going on in the laboratory classrooms, because I think what University of Chicago did, somebody can correct me, I think it also what happened at Columbia in the Teachers College there is that they have what they call laboratory classrooms, where they were experimenting with different ways of teaching students. And they were following Dewey's idea of that experience is the basis of knowledge. That's the basic idea. I could be wrong. Again, Kieser will correct me. So I don't think that in 1930 or even later in the early 50s, our Missouri Synod faculties were really aware of that. But by the 70s, I know they were into it. And they saw the Ivy League, the top teacher colleges in the United States as kind of what they wanted to follow. And they didn't really have a critical eye toward it, which was a mistake. They should have been saying, well, this is what Kaler says. If you listen to what he says is, we have to make use of whatever is sane, good, and profitable. So he's saying we need to look at things with a critical eye, because we have a different approach and we have different goals. Because all that the parish schools, the public schools want to produce are two things. They want to make good citizens, and they want to make valuable citizens that are good workers. That's it. But we also want to make good Christians out of them. And so that's a whole other thing, and that takes a lot of time. And we don't want the ideologies of what makes a good citizen to some government officials. We don't want that influencing what we're doing in the Christian way of things. So I think they were kind of, they didn't really know what was going on then. So it's in hindsight. I mean, I think it's the same thing with the Concordia Seminary in the 1950s, where it started going liberal. The rest of the church didn't know that was going on. until some guys were whistleblowers. Confessional Lutheran by Bergdorf was the first one to do that and say, do you know what they're teaching over there? And then people start saying, what are they teaching over there? Well, why is this pastor teaching this strange stuff about Moses and Jonah and all that? Where do you get that? But that was in the mid-50s. So it takes a while for people to realize. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my take on it anyway. Yes, sir.
I'm Pastor James DeLoach from Zion Lutheran Church in Kearney, Nebraska.
Pastor Loach, pleasure to meet you.
And we are blessed with a parochial school. What I find pastorally is when it comes to finding good resources that have been laid out in terms of providing a matrix of, catechetical memory work along with hymnody and liturgy and the like, there's a dearth of materials. What we get currently through Concordia Publishing House doesn't have the depth that could be utilized in that context. So, are there resources out there? And if some of the guys today and tomorrow can point me toward those, that'd be marvelous. But secondly, I served a congregation in Louisville, Nebraska, that had a school until 1918, when a cross was burned outside of the church property, telling them that they should no longer use German. And it was within a few years after that the school was closed. What I wonder, as you were talking about the pastor having that duty, how on earth did he get everything done that he had to get done across the board?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think the pastor realized his limitations really quickly, and if he didn't, his wife told him, or his congregation members told him, some guys could do it. That some guys can fly by the seat of their pants, as they say. That's actually a pilot thing. You can feel the airplane moving with you, and you just go. You go with the flow. Some pastors can do that. They don't have to prepare sermons. They look at the text and bang, they're ready to go. Me, I have to work on it for 10 hours at least. So it depends. So I think some of it was expecting too much out of the pastors. It said there in my thing that the preferred thing was to have a school teacher. But some churches were some villages, really what they were in the rural parts of the United States, were too small. It's all they had. So they had to deal with what they had. Some people didn't complain too much. But when you get into a bigger city or a town, then you're going to expect a teacher. But yeah, there was also a number of my quotes came from a really good book. For those of you that are interested in my topic, it's in my bibliography. Wayne Schmidt was a professor of education at Concordia Seminary, late 90s. And he wrote a book, was published by the Concordia Seminary Publications. I think it's still in print. It's called, here it is, Lutheran Parish School Dates, Documents, Events, and People. And I kind of seen this in some of the other books, but he really lays it out how there were a couple of states that intentionally tried to bury the parish schools of the Lutherans and the Catholics. It was before World War I and after World War I. There was really strong anti-German sentiment, and they tried to bury the schools, and some of those cases went to the Supreme Court. I remember that there was a layman, just an outstanding layman in Cleveland, Ohio, that testified before, and maybe it wasn't Supreme Court, about the benefit of the Lutheran school to the community, and that settled. I mean, after that, they weren't, at least in Ohio. But there were various phases of that, and I don't know all the reasons. You'd have to look at it. But when you study the history of Lutheran education today, you do get that. Anybody that's gone to a Concordia school and an education program, you'll learn about the state statutes that were passed, and then they had to be revoked. So we have gone through that. And now in terms of resources, Concordia Publishing House used to do a lot better job of providing for curriculum materials for parochial schools. I don't know what they do now. They had to do that because there just wasn't much out there, and the states didn't fund their own textbooks. Well, now the states pay for all these textbooks, and so it's hard to compete with that on price or anything else. So you have to look outside of that, and one source is right here in the front. Pastor Bender with the Concordia Catechetical Academy has lots of stuff for all grade levels. So in terms of religious education, I don't think you can do better than what he has. You guys are still publishing, right? And you have a website, CCA. I think that's it. Another thing is you can talk to Pastor Keyser about what the classical school people have found. It's not just Lutherans are doing classical schools. There are a lot of Christians around the country, and they are now publishing catalogs of great material. So he knows those vendors, those publishers, the websites. I'm sending them all to you, Stephen, because they're great material. So there's no reason that you should be without good material. It just takes a while to find it. So that's the answer to that question. I think we're out of time unless there's one more question.
We can do one more.
Okay, one more.
Thank you very much for such a clear, helpful presentation. 1834, the free education in Pennsylvania, and then the just relinquishing those schools. Do you have an opinion about to what extent our heritage, the Saxon immigrants, the reason for them coming over here, contributed to the, relentless hold on hanging onto our schools, starting them and holding on to them for the first, 50, 75 years?
Well, we're Germans.
We're Germans.
I'm partly German, so I know. So I get in trouble because I can be stubborn sometimes. I just let the German out of me, and then here I stand, right? That's the way we are. And, well, I mean, if you studied your Lutheran theology and you compare it to the Bible, you say, we're right. It isn't like everybody else is totally wrong, but why would I be anything but a Lutheran? And so I come to America, and why would I want my children to be anything but Lutheran or to marry kids that are Lutheran? But how am I going to do that here? So, and the story over there in Germany is that the teachers, Pastor Martin Stephan got into trouble because of his own problems. But the school teachers over there that were associated with Stephan and the Stephanites, they were getting into trouble because they opposed the rationalist, what they were supposed to teach. They wanted to teach the Bible. They wanted to teach the catechism and the basics. And the rationalist superintendents wouldn't let the teachers do that. And some of the young pastors that came over and didn't have parish calls were the same guys that had the problems over there. So the crunch, the pressure was happening to the school teachers, and the parents were in favor of what the school teachers were trying to do. So it was the government in charge of the schools. By the way, maybe you didn't know this, and I didn't put it in my paper. I probably should have. Before the Napoleonic War, the churches were in charge of the schools. And Napoleon, when he took over the German Empire, the most important thing he changed of all the German states is he put the government in charge of the schools. And of course, Napoleon didn't hold on to Germany very long, but the government continued to hold on to the schools. And so then the one thing that influenced the Germans more than anything else out of the French Revolution was the passing of the control of the schools from the church to the state in Germany. And then the heirs of that were Walther and his company, where his parents grew up under the Napoleonic Wars of before and was the church in charge. And Walther and his buddies, his age, the government's in charge, and they're forcing us to teach something out of Kant, rationalism. And I can't do that and be a Christian. So that's, I think, more than anything else, because you kind of do what you wanted in your own parish. I mean, they're not going to drag you down because you're preaching from the Bible in a Lutheran church, even back then. But the control over the school was very tight. And so they couldn't, the Lutheran school teachers that were conservative could not teach what they wanted to teach their kids. And that's Forster, who's the historian that talks about the immigration, makes a big deal of the Stephanite problems, and that's correct. But he just mentions this issue, and I think somebody could do a whole dissertation on the role of the German school teacher prior to the Stephanite immigration and the dissatisfaction. Everybody was unhappy with that in the German states. It wasn't just them, but they're the ones that decided, we're not going to try to fight this. We're just going to leave and start our own churches and schools. That's why. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you very much.